Hey guys, this is WhytManga here with a new video. And in this video, I'm going to be giving you guys some tips and information when it comes to plot techniques when planning out your story. I think this can be a series that I can do over time, but for this first video, I'm going to be talking about a plot technique called Meanwhile Back at the Ranch. Most of the techniques I'll talk about in this series would basically be techniques that will help you keep your readers or your audience more engaged or continuously engaged, basically keeping their engagement within your work. There'll also be tips you can apply to certain parts of your story to keep everything in tip-top condition. Meanwhile at the Ranch is basically when you have mostly two or more stories kind of happening at the same time, where the viewer or reader or whatever is kind of taken on two journeys side by side and seeing several character perspectives or seeing several stories take place one at a time. The switch would happen when that story has reached a certain peak, or it's close to the peak, or it's about to climax or something like that, and then the switch happens. This is usually when a scene ends, and when a scene ends, that's usually, after maybe a twist or some kind of reveal or some kind of information is being given to the audience, or a cliffhanger or something like that. It could be where when you're watching a show where it would maybe go to advertisements and things like that, or that's where usually the switch would happen. So in the switch in this case is switching from story A to story B. Then obviously they're still within that world, still within that story, and usually kind of tie in together. And in some cases they don't tie in together as much, but it's within that world, and so most times, 9 times out of 10, they do tie in together. A good example of this would be Sin City, where I think there are like 3 stories going on at the same time. But see, another example would be Pulp Fiction. But when it comes to simple examples that'll help you understand exactly what I'm talking about, will be shows like, say, Family Guy, Always Sunny in Philadelphia. If you're familiar with these shows, they usually split the characters to take on 2 separate adventures at the same time. In an episode of Family Guy, you might have Peter and his friends doing one thing, and Stewie and Brian doing another thing. In some cases, one story is more significant than the other, but they're happening at the same time, and as soon as one is about to peak, they switch to the other. In Always Sunny in Philadelphia, the same thing happens. They split the gang. So you might have Charlie and Mac go do one thing, and then you have Dee, Frank, and Dennis doing another. And it usually still ties in together. So, mostly with like Always Sunny, it kind of ties in together. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. Another good example would be to actually go through, I think it's a children's story called Meanwhile at the Ranch, which explains, or is a perfect example of what I'm talking about, which is where I believe the name comes from, is Meanwhile Back at the Ranch, to be more. So it's kind of one story is happening, meanwhile another story is happening. And sometimes maybe at the end of the full overarching story, you can see how both stories kind of connect and tie in together. And maybe that's a twist in itself. It all applies on what you want to do. There isn't one way to do anything in storytelling, and that's what you will learn in time, is that you take these techniques and see how they work for you while you're questioning everything and having an answer for your questions, creating your original piece of art. Because even though you're using Meanwhile at the Ranch, it's just a technique. Why use it? Does it fit to use it right now? There's some cases, say in manga, where one story would take place for the whole chapter, and the meanwhile only happens at the end of the chapter. And so, say a fight is going on, and right at the end of the fight, at the end of the chapter, maybe before the final blow is struck, the chapter ends, go into the next chapter, the fight from the previous chapter doesn't continue, they start from somewhere else. And maybe in that next chapter, they do a meanwhile at back at the ranch within that chapter to finish the battle from the previous chapter. So you can get really, really trippy with it. But the whole purpose and goal is to kind of keep everything interesting, and you never lose the engagement from the audience. So as soon as the story is starting to feel a little boring, even though it's not, but you can see that it's losing momentum, you switch. I can't speak for too many comics out there, but for my comic, I do this. For those who don't know, I'm the creator of Apple Black. I write and illustrate my own story. It's published and serialized on Saturday AM. You can read the first 4 chapters free. I'll leave links to where you can check all that stuff out in the comments below. Links to everything you could possibly need about me would also be in the comments below. Social media, Saturday AM, all the other comics on Saturday AM, where you can purchase volume 1 of Apple Black with the first 9 chapters. And you can see within these chapters where I actually apply this technique. So visually for this video, to keep things interesting, you can see me inking my pages for chapters 16 for Apple Black Volume 2. And here you can kind of see how I kind of start out inking, where I ink the panels, I ink the text bubbles and balloons, and also ink the sound effects before I actually go in inking the backgrounds and the characters. But in this chapter, same as other chapters, I apply this technique of meanwhile back at the ranch. But here, it's a little more complex. So I'll try to explain without really spoiling anything for the chapter. So within this 14-page chapter, I take the first 2 pages, and let's just call that mini story, call it story A. You know, obviously everything's kind of happening in the same world, it's happening at the same time. It's all one story, but just to separate scenes from one another, just gonna call it story A and story B. So the first 2 pages out of the 14-page chapter kind of cover story A. And then I seamlessly transition and do a meanwhile back at the ranch to story B after the 2nd page. And when you see it, when you read the chapter, it'll make more sense. Then from page 3 to 6, I'm telling story B, but story B kind of ends in a way where I'm putting the readers in a position where they want to flip the page to see what happens on the next page, because they're intrigued at that point. At least I hope they are. And once they do that, in this case, rather than seeing what they expect, I go back to story A. And it'll all make sense, at least it's supposed to make sense at the end of the chapter. So it's like story B was kind of hitting a peak, but before I hit it, I switched back to story A. Story A now is kind of starting to hit a peak, and it involves several other stories happening at the same time. So here I'm actually, once I go back to story A, I'm actually touching on story C, D, and E very briefly. It's almost like giving them half a page or a page, right? Because it's very seamless. Like, we're not diving into those stories or those scenes in great detail. There's barely any dialogue, because from story A, someone in story A, once we've come back to it, is kind of having a monologue, and that monologue is being told while all these other stories are being shown. I don't know if that makes sense. But that's, you know, this is the scene. This is basically the scene that I'm inking in front of you. It's almost like story A has engulfed story C, D, and E in a way. So it's almost doing that. Once you go back there, you do a meanwhile back at the ranch to story C, another one to D, another one to E, and then back to A. Then something happens in A where it then makes sense to finish off what happens in story B, you know, because I left the audience hanging. When I come back from story E back to A, something happens in A where it makes sense to finish off B. So I finish off B, and then I come back to A, and then I end the chapter. Now I know that didn't make that much sense to most people, especially because I'm trying not to spoil what happens, but I'm just letting you know that this is a case where I've applied certain elements of this plot technique, meanwhile back at the ranch, to Apple Black. And obviously it's not this complex all the time. It's complex in this chapter, but in other chapters it might just be, you know, going back and forth a little bit here and there, just to keep things interesting. As one story is peaking, you switch. That's the essential idea, but I'm just giving you an example where I'm taking that concept and exploring with it and doing much more, trying to make things a little more dynamic and cinematic with it. And that's something you can do. That's why I always say that there isn't one way to do things. And you know, sometimes what you do, even if it's unorthodox, might not always work. But if you can challenge it and, you know, get some feedback and do your best to make sure it works, but 9 times out of 10, if you can defend it, not necessarily challenge and defend it, then you're in a good place. That's pretty much it for this video. Quick update on volume 2. I only have like 2 chapters left to complete. As for the volume cover, I've done the back. I haven't done the cover itself, and I still need to do the covers for each individual chapter, which I might make part of the marketing strategy, where you know, each individual chapter cover drawing would be a video on itself, just so you guys can see me using Copic markers or any digital tools that I'm using to come up with the chapter covers. But so far so good. I hope this video helps you when you're writing your own stories. Please don't forget to like this video, leave a comment if you have any questions, Leave a comment if you thought I was confusing. Subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell so you stay notified each time I upload a video. And I'll be back with more plot techniques and also some more drawing videos. It's WhytManga, and I'm out.